Hi there, welcome everybody to the cross-party group meeting for co-ops and mutuals. I'm Mike Erskine, events organiser here today at the Wales Cooperative Centre. I'd just like to invite and introduce our chair, who's been doing this for a while, Vicky Howes. So welcome, Vicky. I'll pass things over to you now.
Oh, thanks, Mike. Welcome everyone to the first session of this cross-party group on cooperatives and mutuals of 2022. It's always a great cross-party group, and today we're going to be looking at a really topical issue, which is community-led housing in Wales and what can be done to further expand the role of the cooperative sector within that. So cooperative and community-led housing is all about local people taking a leading role and a lasting role in creating secure, affordable homes and strengthening their communities. So in this meeting today, we're going to be discussing one of the key barriers to the development of community-led housing that we have identified, and that is access to suitable land. And so we've got three guest speakers with us today. Our first guest speaker is going to be Casey Edwards from the Communities Creating Homes programme at the Wales Cooperative Centre. And Casey's going to discuss a paper that has been written and will soon be published. Casey will then be followed by Harry Thompson from the IWA and Chris Blake from the Skyline Project. And there'll be an opportunity for question and answer session later on. So without further ado then, if I can welcome Casey and invite her up to the main stage to start off our event.
Lovely, thanks Vicky. Hopefully everyone can hear and see me, and I will just share my presentation. Hopefully everyone can see that. Everybody has now disappeared from my screen, so I can only see my presentation, but hopefully you can see it very clearly. So thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So like Vicky said, my name is Casey Edwards. I'm a community-led housing advisor working on the Communities Creating Homes programme at the Wales Cooperative Centre, and I'm here today to talk about community ownership of land and assets to enable the delivery of community-led housing in Wales. So hopefully most of you are aware of the Wales Cooperative Centre and the work that we do. And basically we've been supporting the cooperative and social enterprise sectors since 1982. And we are seen as the voice for the social economy and inclusion in Wales. One of the current projects and programmes that is part of the Wales Cooperative Centre is the Communities Creating Homes programme, which is specifically the programme that I work on. And this is the cooperative and community-led housing programme that aims to create a thriving community-led housing movement, which grows the supply of good quality, affordable homes that meets local need and where communities will grow and prosper. The programme is funded by the Nationwide Foundation and the Welsh Government, and has been running for the last 3 years. We are Wales's only community-led housing hub, and we are part of a wider network of hubs across the UK. And we have a team of accredited advisors specialising in all forms of community-led housing to grow the movement here. So I've been asked here today to talk about the community ownership of land and assets in order to grow the community-led housing movement and enable the delivery of more affordable community-led homes. And we feel that many of today's challenges faced by society are actually come back to land ownership, and that includes the cost of housing, sort of so-called left behind communities, and the climate crisis. And we feel that public policy and current market practice is struggling to meet these challenges. So we've developed this discussion paper, which has been shared with participants to reignite the discussions in Wales about community ownership of land and assets. And we feel that there needs to be a change in people's abilities to access and own land suitable for the development of the much needed, perpetually affordable community-led housing and, of course, other services. So today I'm going to give you a brief overview of community-led housing, what it is. Some of you may not have heard of it before. going to give you a history of community-led housing in Wales and sort of the current projects that we're supporting, some of the issues that they face, and then go on to talk about how land and access to land can help to grow the movement and what we'd like to see in Wales to enable further delivery of community-led homes. So, like Vicky perfectly summed it up, community-led housing is about local people taking a leading and lasting role in creating secure, affordable homes and strengthening their communities. It could be a group of friends collectively buying a shared house or shared properties because they can't afford individual mortgages. It could be leaseholders jointly coming together to manage their homes, or social housing tenants coming together to manage their homes. It could be local people taking over a piece of land in their community, developing new homes, or it could be people developing one planet developments on a community scale. There are multiple different models and different ways of doing it, but we feel that there are 4 key principles to community-led housing, and that is that the development of homes, or the creation of homes, has to be led by the community. A project doesn't have to necessarily be initiated by the community, but it's important that the voice of the community is heard and influences that development. The community have to own, manage or steward the homes in the long term. There must be collective benefits, so it's not about lining the pockets of private housing developers. It's all about keeping that collective benefit within the local community or the community group. And for us, the homes have to be affordable. Obviously, we're funded by the Welsh Government, and we want to help them to achieve their targets of providing more affordable housing for people in need. And community-led housing can include new build or refurbishment of homes. It's not one particular type, and it covers all tenures. So it can be everything from social housing to intermediate rent to shared ownership. The possibilities are endless, really. And we feel that there are many benefits to this kind of housing. It diversifies the market. It protects prices in perpetuity. It enables regeneration and placemaking within towns and villages, and can bring empty homes back into use. And also, it's not just about providing affordable housing. We also see that there are many well-being benefits to living this way, including increasing confidence and skills and knowledge, decreasing loneliness, and improving community cohesion as well. And we did some research on that over the last couple of years, which is available to have a look at all of these different benefits. So here's just a selection of projects from across the UK, just to show the options of community-led housing. So on the left-hand side, we've got Bridport co-housing project down in the south, which is the biggest co-housing project in the UK, and it's currently on site and will deliver more than 50 mixed tenure homes. And that's in an area where second home ownership is particularly high. So these homes will be allocated specifically for people with a local connection, and that's being completely led by the community. In the middle there on the top, we've got Nodi'r Cyfarfod, which is Wales's newest housing cooperative, and residents have come together here and are actually purchasing this property from a private landlord and setting up a cooperative. On the top left there, we've got Granby 4 Streets, where this community in Liverpool have formed a community land trust to save a row of terraced houses that were to be demolished. And they've now developed 10 socially rented homes with a registered social landlord, and are also providing retail space, a community garden, community art space. So really regenerated that complete area. And on the bottom here, we've got Lilac in Leeds, which is one of the most famous, probably, community-led housing projects. And this common ownership housing project is affordable rents, and the rents are linked to people's wages, so it's really affordable and people can build equity as they go along. So they have some money to buy a property, maybe if they ever decide to leave, which I'm sure most of them will probably not. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of community-led housing in Wales. And don't worry, I'm not going to go back to 1771 when Robert Owen was born in Newtown, but obviously he is seen as the father of the cooperative movement, and his new Lanark Mills project was one of the most advanced social programmes for housing and education in the country, and it was set up to tackle rogue landlords, rampant capitalism, and bad housing. And those principles are still true for the community-led housing, I feel. So we're going to go back to 2011 when the coordinated support for community-led housing really kicked off in Wales with the Welsh Labour Manifesto in 2011, and the first cooperative housing project was born from that manifesto, where the Wales Cooperative Centre started to support community-led housing projects in 2012, and 3 pioneer schemes were developed with funding from Welsh Government from then. We then move on to cooperative housing being included in the Housing Wales Act, and increased Welsh Government support, which has led to the creation of our Communities Creating Homes programme, which is due to end this year, but we're hopeful of continuation funding. And we were really pleased to see support for cooperative community-led housing in the programme for government and the Welsh Labour Plaid Cymru cooperation agreement. So we're currently supporting 60 projects across Wales that are projected to deliver over 500 homes. So this map shows sort of the range of projects that we're supporting, and the green marks indicate schemes that have already set up, and they may have set up without our support when there was a lot of funding for this kind of for these kind of projects around in the 70s and 80s. And all are at varying stages of development, and all models are included, but barriers still remain, and we feel that these barriers can only be overcome with the support of the Welsh Government and other stakeholders. So these are some of our reoccurring issues that we find as a project, and the top 2 are really the most popular issues. So funding, that's early stage funding for groups, and then capital to develop, but also finding and acquiring a site. Those are the 2 main barriers that our groups tell us about. So just to sort of move swiftly on to land and how land affects the community-led housing sector, currently our groups are reliant on either philanthropic landowners to access land, or maybe on a community asset transfer or the compulsory purchase order policy enabled to access land. And we feel that our current planning system and housing market are dominated by a shrinking number of profit-driven developers that too often produce unaffordable and poor quality homes, which local communities maybe don't want. And our most deprived communities have little or no agency to turn things around and are neglected by the mainstream market actors. So currently our groups tell us that they can't find suitable sites, they can't access these sites. And then the competition and cost for these sites just makes delivering community-led housing absolutely impossible. So we feel that Wales community empowerment and ownership rights to develop to help deliver the commitments set out in the programme for government and the cooperation agreement. And we want to enhance the participatory democracy at a local level and transfer the balance of power away from wealthy landowners to ensure that people across Wales have a greater ability to shape their local area. And it's time to listen to local people and trust them to take the lead. So these sorts of policies exist elsewhere in the UK. So in Scotland, you've got the Community Empowerment Act that enables communities to access, buy and own land enabled in order to deliver affordable housing as well as many other services. The Localism Act in England allows some similar powers, but not as many as in Scotland. But this agenda is really being discussed across the UK, and Liverpool City Region have recently set up their own land commission to review the land health building. So it's obviously a hot topic at the minute, and we feel that Wales is really lagging behind. And although barriers remain across the UK to community ownership, and we've done some research into that, the political discourse on localism and community empowerment has really increased the profile of community-led housing amongst local communities, landowners, housing providers, and local councils who are now more actively engaged in the movement. So we feel if we did something similar in Wales, then obviously the community-led housing movement would grow. So like we said at the beginning, we've put together this short discussion paper to reignite the conversation about community ownership, and we've included some recommendations for a new approach in Wales to community ownership. So we would like to see a commission set up to stimulate innovative thinking on community ownership of land and assets in Wales. And, you know, we recognise that we're not the experts in this field, and there are many other sectors and organisations interested in this agenda. But we would like this commission to research and make recommendations on the various different options of community ownership, and look into things like tax, land value, capturing that land value, and the current data and information that is available on land in Wales. We feel that then the Commission should inform the development of new community empowerment and ownership legislation to bring Wales in line with Scotland and England. We'd like to see a community wealth fund set up using dormant assets that would invest long-term in places that need it most and support communities to develop social infrastructure. And I know that this is being discussed in Parliament this week, aside obviously the catastrophe that is Boris Johnson at the minute. But yeah, it really is high on the agenda of many politicians. And I know that Paul Howell, the MP for Sedgefield, is calling for this community wealth fund, as well as many other third sector and community organisations across the UK. We'd also like to see a revolving loan fund for community-led housing projects, as we feel that access to finance will enable the growth and delivery of more affordable housing. And we'd like to see strengthened policy guidance on community-led housing in Wales. The existing powers that we have allow for community-led housing projects to develop, but we feel that further guidance is needed to really push the movement forward. So that could, for example, include a technical advice note specifically on community-led housing, or maybe supplementary planning guidance from local authorities. And just to, I suppose, quickly highlight the potential of community ownership of land and assets. So this is a project up in Scotland, in the town of Wigtown, and it's by the Wigtown and Bladnoch Community Initiative. And this is an area that was suffering from very little social housing, and all of the private rented accommodation was completely unaffordable. There was high demand for family housing. So the community initiative, which is a community development organisation up there, decided to use the community right to an old bank building on the high street, and they subsequently converted it into 2 affordable units. And a bunkhouse for tourist accommodation. So not only are they providing affordable homes, but they're also taking the tourist industry into community ownership, which is great. And you'll be able to hear more from that project at our community-led housing network at the end of the month. So what's next? We would like to work with partners, the community-led housing movement and MSs, to co-produce a more detailed discussion paper on community ownership and empowerment rights in Wales. And please get in touch if you'd like to be part of the discussion. We really recognise that this is not just about housing, and that community ownership of land and assets could have a much wider impact on multiple sectors rather than just housing. So really encourage you to get in touch if you'd like to be part of co-producing that paper. And like I said, we're having our All Wales Community-led Housing Network on Thursday, the 27th of January at midday. And we'll be hearing more from the Wigtown and Bladnoch Community Initiative. And you're more than welcome to come along and discuss this agenda further. So diolch yn much. I'm happy to take questions, and sorry I've gone a little bit over.
Thanks very much indeed, Casey. That's great, really great overview for us to start us off today, and some excellent recommendations on that outline paper as well. So I think what we'll do is we'll save questions until all our 3 speakers have done their contributions, just to try and make sure that we stick to time, with plenary being this afternoon for members as well. So our next speaker is Harry Thompson from the Institute of Welsh Affairs. Harry is economic lead at the IWA. I'm sure he's very well known to many of you. And I know, Harry, that you're currently managing a project on the future of land and ownership in Wales, and you're soon going to be publishing a report outlining the Welsh context. So we're really pleased to be able to welcome you here to the CPG today to discuss this with us in more detail. So I will hand over to you. Welcome, Harry.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to start by thanking the organisers. I think this is a really fruitful topic of conversation, and I'm really glad the CPG is having it. So, as Vicky said, my name is Harry. I work as the IWA's economic policy lead, and since March, I've been working on a project about communities and land use. We've been talking to community groups and farmers from across Wales about how we can develop policy that gives communities a greater say over land in their area, whilst not disadvantaging those who depend on it, such as farmers. I'll admit that when I started working for the IWA on the topic of land, I was unsure that it was the most exciting subject in the world. I think that all of us involved in this policy area kind of know that things like planning, for example, can be pretty dry subject matter, but I've become convinced of the importance of this topic to communities, and I'm now viewing it as a bit of a personal mission to get people to see why land isn't boring and why it's so important. For starters, land is the literal foundation of a country. There's no real conception of a Wales or of a UK that doesn't start with two things: land and its people. There are more specific examples of its importance too. Given that we have an audience here who have a lot of interest in housing, I think you'd be interested to know that the UK government has found that on average, about 70% of the price of a house is made up of the value of the land that it's built on. So when you talk about prices in a housing crisis, quite often what you're actually talking about is a land crisis. It's a finite resource that you can't really make more of. And basic laws of supply and demand tell us that as the population grows and demand for land grows, the price is going to go up too. So it's a key part of the housing crisis. And this is obviously particularly true in certain areas, such as cities or areas with high demand for second homes, leading to some areas really reaching crisis levels. So unlocking land for communities aiming to build housing is a key aspect of tackling the housing crisis with community-led housing. That's why I'm so interested in this topic and the Wales Co-op Centre's paper, and it's why the IWA has been undertaking our own project on land use and community rights. So at this point, I know Casey's mentioned it slightly in her really interesting presentation, but it's probably worth filling in some of the context on community rights from Scotland, which does provide something of a blueprint for Wales. In Scotland, they've got the Scottish Land Fund for bids of between £5,000 and £1 million, which gives grants to communities to buy land and other community assets. So this fund is a total of £10 million a year, and that's increasing soon to £20 million a year. So the Scottish Government is soon going to be giving £100 million out to communities to buy land and assets in each Scottish parliamentary term. And that's on top of the huge community buyouts they've already seen over the past 2 decades of devolution. As Casey also mentioned, the Scottish Parliament has passed multiple acts on this: the Land Reform Act in 2003, the Community Empowerment Act in 2015, and the Land Reform Act of 2016. So they're also in the process of drafting a new bill on this issue. So these acts, as Casey mentioned, give Scottish communities various powers, including the right of first refusal to communities to buy land and other community assets that come up for sale. Essentially, this means that communities can register an interest in land or assets, such as land or pubs and village halls, and when they're eventually proposed for sale or transfer by the owner, the community has the first right to buy it. And this, combined with that Scottish Land Fund, gives communities real power to create change in their area. There are even provisions for communities to force the sale of derelict land without the seller being willing. It's worth noting, even though they're less widespread or less powerful, in England, through the UK government, they have a number of community powers too. Communities have to keep a register of these assets of community value, and communities theoretically have the right to bid for these assets. It's not the right to buy, but the right to bid. They have the right to challenge, to take over the running of services, and they have something called the right to build, which allows community organisations to bring forward small-scale development without the need for planning permission, which is obviously of huge interest to community-led housing. However, our work over the last year has found a stark and pretty disappointing, to be honest, situation in Wales. Despite numerous opportunities to do so. Oh, hi, Mike. Despite numerous opportunities to do so and commissions recommended that they do so, Wales has not introduced any real statutory rights for communities. Welsh communities are the least empowered on this island, despite our reputation for communitarianism and strong community bonds. So while Scotland is drafting its fourth piece of legislation on this topic, Wales has done pretty much nothing at all. When something comes up for sale in Wales, communities are vulnerable to the whims of the markets. What happens in their local area is what the market decides. In reality, that's often extremely wealthy people not based in the area. How many times have we seen in Cardiff recently an old pub the community wants to protect be demolished for student flats with no legal community right to stop it? The debates surrounding the Roath Park pub or Guildford Crescent sorry, Mike, would have been very different if the community had a right of first refusal to buy the building.
Just give me a shout.
As well as a government grant funding pot to apply to, as in Scotland. And it's not just an urban issue either. We've seen numerous reports of investment funds buying up old family farms in Wales to benefit from the increases in the price of land and to cash in from Welsh Government tree planting schemes. Farmers have raised concerns with us this trend could actually kill communities, with the agricultural industry often being the economic basis for many rural communities, including huge swathes of Welsh-speaking areas. So we've got to be very careful that we don't take that economic basis away from communities and rural communities, because we've seen with the mining industry the damage that can cause. Our research has also found that farmers are really active members of rural communities and that are very concerned about topics such as the second home crisis. So they were open to these proposals too. So when we were speaking to community groups in Wales, they spoke of a really horrible environment to operate in Wales, to be honest, with no real process to take over land or assets. Words that came up often when we were speaking to them were demoralising and draining. Every single community group we spoke to in Wales had a negative experience of the process and spoke about it negatively, whether or not they were successful. They said there was no real process to take over those privately owned assets, so they were left trying to access land and assets that were being disposed of by public bodies. But they also said that there was no real process for this, and that guidance such as on the guidance the Welsh Government's produced on community asset transfers often wasn't followed. Some of them went as far as to say that they felt bullied during the process. So comparing that to Scotland and England, where we've got a lot of community rights, there's a real negative story coming out of Wales on this. For example, one group spoke of a really frustrating process to try and create a community garden in a really deprived area that had seen many community assets lost to austerity. And after long and arduous negotiations, they got an agreement, only to find the council departments hadn't communicated with each other. And another department came and changed the locks to the sites when they were in. So, and as I mentioned, these stories were pretty much universal among groups we spoke to. So, one of the biggest disappointments for us in this is that we have obviously just undergone a period of austerity driven by the UK government, which has obviously had an impact on the Welsh government and local authorities here. So we know, because Unison have done analysis, that between 2010 and 2019, 193 youth centres in Wales closed. We all know examples of things that have been sold off in the last decade. And if we had had that community empowerment legislation, as in Scotland and to a certain extent England, these assets could have been contributing to thriving communities instead of being converted into things like student flats. So we've penciled the launch of our report in for the 1st of February, so I'll try and not give too much away. But I will say that we're going to be recommending pretty similar things to the Wales Co-op Centre, as you've seen in that report, including that the Welsh Government legislate for some of the measures that we've seen in Scotland, such as that community right to buy. I can also say within the sanctity of these 4 virtual walls that we have just commissioned some polling from YouGov on those recommendations. It's just come in, and I'll give you a little preview, which is that we found widespread support for these proposals, these Scottish-style proposals, from the Welsh public. In fact, there was huge support from every group of people in Wales, support from every political party, from Remainers and Leavers, from every age group, from every social class, both men and women. Every group supported having that community empowerment legislation in place. So the timer is ticking down. So I'll finish by saying thanks once again to the CPG for having me, and to the Wales Co-op Centre for their work on this. And hopefully very soon we'll be seeing the introduction of policies that are cost effective, wildly popular, and allow us to tackle the housing crisis and make communities feel more valued in the process. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Harry. That was a really interesting contribution. I think particularly to see that, you know, it is a pan-Wales problem, and it's a problem that affects all sorts of communities and people of every age and social status within those communities as well. So really interesting, and look forward to seeing your report when it comes out. And I think it will be great if it chimes with what the Wales Co-op Centre is saying as well. It'll be more power to the elbow for those of us who are calling for reform in this area. So thanks very much. So our final speaker then, before we go on to Q&A where people will be able to question all three speakers, our final speaker is Chris Blake from the Skyline Project, which is a project that has really grown in notoriety and attracted attention from all over Wales. So I'm sure that lots of you will be familiar with it already. The Skyline Project is essentially a collaboration between the community and a number of different organisations, including the Rhondda Housing Association, Welcome to Our Woods, Green Valleys Kick, Wood Knowledge Wales, the National Lottery, and of course the Welsh Government as well. And it aims to give residents control over the mountains and woodlands surrounding the Upper Rhondda Fawr through the founding of a community land trust. So welcome, Chris, and we look forward to everything that you're going to tell us about your project and your views on all these issues. So
okay, Vicky, thanks very much. I'm just going to see if I can share a screen. I think that may prove more difficult than I sorry about that. I'm not going to be able to do. I don't think I'm going to easily be able to do that. I'm unfamiliar with this platform.
Hi, Chris. I think I've got a copy. So if you
okay,
might be able to get them up for you on screen. Just spare me 1 sec.
While they're appearing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start. Forgive me, but I'm going to start with a very broad. I'm going to stand several steps back and look at a global and a historic perspective on what's happening. And if we've got the first slide's helpful for
yeah, they're just coming, Chris.
They're brilliant. I can do. Is it not going to come, Mike?
I'm just downloading it, Chris. I was just there. I wasn't expecting a backup. I've got a backup for you. I just downloading the files now for you. 1 sec. Okay. You start to introduce. Should be able to get it up on screen now.
Okay, brilliant. So the perspective I'm taking is that what's been going on for years. Land is very important land's been important for humans for 50,000 years, and it gives us four really vital assets. It gives us energy, it gives us food, it gives us timber, and it gives us housing. And one of the things which, working on the Skyline Project, thinking about land and control of land, what's been happening, I would say over decades, and it's been going on for longer than that, is the places that make the decisions about how land is managed to give us those four yields has been going further and further away. It's ended up in a global market. A lot of the decisions about how we create food, how we create energy, and how timber is produced are being made by a global market. And they're not being made by the people who actually live in a place anymore. And I think this is one of the values which determine how we manage that land to give us those four yields, are the values of the market, or of people who are may in some cases live thousands of miles away. Think of a farmer who's putting in an intensive chicken rearing facility. The decisions that the farmer may still own the land, but the decisions about how that land is managed might now be made by a corporation that's 3,000 miles away, and his key interest is making sure that there's enough profit to repay the capital loans. And so the decisions, the local decisions, the values of local people are no longer being expressed in the land management decisions are being made. And I think this is in some ways the poor management of land by values which are distant from the place is behind some of the social, economic and climate crises and biodiversity crises that we've got at the moment. So my one story is we have to find a way to get the values of local people into the way local decisions, land management decisions are made, and how they give us those four yields. That's really important. I'm going to come on to, if you move on, click on Mike to the next slide. I mean, the Skyline Project, Vicky gave a very good introduction. It's about trying to get some community, exactly what I was just saying, getting the community control, community values established into the way that land is managed. And I started off with a very optimistic view that we could just take what we've seen in Scotland. We've been to Scotland, we've seen what we've done in Scotland. Let's give the community the ownership of that land, and it would be really simple. And land ownership gives you the best control over what you do with the land. So ownership is great. I'm all for ownership, but this land is public land, and it isn't necessarily true that we want to transfer ownership. So one of the things we've been exploring is how can you get community values for land established without a transfer of ownership. And there are a couple of ways we can do this. One is through a leasehold agreement, a management agreement. So we don't have to buy the land, but we could work in partnership with NRW, partnership with the Welsh Government, and lease the land for 100 years and work with them to agree management plans of how that can be done. And that could work extremely well. The other thing that we've been doing, and I'll come back to housing specifically in a moment. One of the things we've been doing is we've been working on a co-design of the forest, a vision, co-producing what the vision looks like. This is actually listening, not a consultation. What we've traditionally had, what NRW have traditionally done, is come up with a forest management plan and done a consultation with the community who don't really understand commercial forestry. What we're doing is we're starting with community values, what's important to the community, and entering into a co-design process where those values are going to be binding on NRW. And I'm going to praise NRW for the courage they've got of entering into a co-production, co-design process with the community, where the community values are going to get enshrined and are binding on the future of that forest plan. And so we spend a lot of time talking to the community about what the values are and how they want to see those values expressed. And what we get is really, it's like they haven't, but it's like they've read and completely digested the Wellbeing Act. They have a very nuanced, well-balanced view of economy, of jobs, of local jobs, of economic interest in the forest, of nature, of climate change, of carbon capture, of flood prevention. All of these things are a very nuanced and balanced view of how that should be managed, and that is going to be enshrined. So we're actually producing 100-year future forest vision for what that forest, how that forest can be managed. Now, the community may play all sorts of roles. It may end up with a leasehold arrangement for deploying some of that. It may not, and other communities. And one of the advantages of having a co-produced vision is that you don't require the capital to buy the land, and you don't require a community who actually is going to implement it, and yet you can still get the values enshrined into the way that land is managed. Just going on, so this is just a few slides from some of the value capture we've been doing, working with the community, listening to them, letting it come up. This is a picture on the ownership model. This is from Scotland. This is one of the community, the Scottish community projects in Scotland. That housing in the bottom right picture, that's a community housing unit. It costs £60,000 to build. It uses the timber that's on the same site, that timber came 2 kilometres. It's processed on site with jobs from local jobs, creating affordable housing. And the whole 3-bedroom house had a unit cost of £60,000 and is zero carbon. It was quite a fantastic achievement, and that is the community, because it has the ownership of that land, has the ownership of the forest. It can use to deploy its values to determine how the forest is used and how the housing is used. If you just go on again, actually got a. Can you just click that on, and there's a few, it builds up. I'll just say what we're doing at the moment, and then I'll come on to this and some more in a moment. This is the what we're doing here. This is the co-working between Natural Resources Wales and the community, and one more, I think, Mike. This is working. We're trying to get what in some ways is the best of both worlds. So we've got the expertise of Natural Resources Wales and their professional forest managing, the values of the local people working together to come up with a plan, which is the best plan for that forest. Now, the Skyline Project does include housing, and we have got, we're working with Rhondda Housing Association, we're working with RCT Council on some land, and we've got a plan to build some zero carbon housing, bit in the Scottish model, using the timber that's in the local thing, processed with people with local jobs, being used to create zero carbon future housing for affordable usage in the community, which is a great cycle. What I'll point out is we could do that if we owned the land, the community. We can also, but we don't have to own it. If we have the right approach, if we capture those values, if we work in partnership with the council, with the Rhondda Housing Association, with the community, we can actually deliver those benefits without. So I'm very much in favour of community ownership, but it's not the only model. There are other ways of doing this. One of the things which is coming out of Skyline, and it's going to be very important, is that a lot of these measures, a lot of these plans are not, they don't maximise short-term profit. And this can be a challenge. So the land that a council owns, it can sell it to a developer now for more money than the community can afford, or more money than will come out of co-producing the housing solution with the local community. But we are working with Welsh Government on using social value calculations to justify this, to allow this to happen. I think this is going to be something we'll be reporting on in the summer, but I think it's a very important aspect, being able to use social value calculations to justify not taking the highest cash benefit. And what we get actually, it's not that it's the short-term benefit, which often we're steered towards by economic criteria. The longer-term benefit of having community forest practices, we'll use continuous cover forestry, which over 100 years will yield you a better return, but it won't match the short-term returns you can get over 20 years. In housing, putting more money, not getting so much cash for the land, but putting in zero carbon means that the running cost of the housing and the affordability of the housing over the long term can be better, and so you get a better decision. So I think what's going to be key here is how we can use social value calculations in justifying this. So my just kind of, I'll stop and conclude. What I'm saying is that partnership. This is a quote from Alistair McIntosh, which actually it really sums up exactly what we think. It's, for me, what's really important is about getting the values of local people who live in a place to be expressed and enshrined in the way the land is managed. Land is managed for food, for timber, for energy production, and for housing. And so we've got to find a new way. Ownership is one way, and ownership is fantastic, and we should do it wherever we can. And all of the things that the Wales Co-op and the IWA are proposing in Wales on supporting ownership, community ownership, is great. But let's not lose, it doesn't have to be ownership. There are other models where we, working in partnership and cooperation and co-production, we can actually enshrine local values into those design plans. And that's something I think we shouldn't lose sight of and should take some more time to do. Thanks.
Thanks very much indeed, Chris. It was good to have that frank appraisal from the ground, or from the mountainside, maybe I should say, to get that that practitioner's voice heard in addition to those of our other speakers as well. So we are now ready for our Q&A session where I'm going to invite all three of our speakers back onto the main stage, and any members of the Senedd as well who want to participate in the discussion, you are most welcome to join us on the main stage too, and you should receive an invitation now to do that. So just click the button if you'd like to come up to the stage. And for all the rest of guests here today, if you'd like to put a question into the question and answer section, which you can see on the right hand side of your screen, that would be great if you could type your question in there, and then we can invite you to come up to the main stage to ask your question if you want, or if you'd just rather it be read out, then we can do that as well. So welcome, great to see some people joining us now on the main stage, and I'm just waiting to see what questions will appear in the Q&A on the screen. Now, we haven't got any yet, but I'm sure we shall get some soon.
Can I start off then, Vicky, with a question as well as a comment?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Mike.
When local authorities are disposing of material, of land, they don't have to go to the highest bidder. They can make a case to the district auditor that they're doing it for public good. How in experience of the three people I've listened to, how often did that happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually, Mike. Any takers for that one? Harry?
Well, I was going to nominate Chris because I think he's Wales's leading expert on social value and community asset transfers. I think.
I think it's technically possible. I think in practice it doesn't happen. We were looking for the community to take not ownership of the land, but to have some timber assets transferred, small value of number of timber assets transferred to the community, and the audit office basically blocked it. And we were not allowed, which is what has forced us down a social value calculation. So we were bluntly told that the provisions of managing Welsh public money, the Treasury Green Book, takes precedence over the Wellbeing Act. I mean, it was as blunt as that.
Can I be helpful here? It has been done. I did it 20 years ago. The sale, if you know Swansea, you know Morgan's Hotel. We sold Morgan's Hotel to Martin Morgan because we wanted a hotel on that site. The best offer we had was to put, you won't be surprised, flats. But we said as part of the development of this city, we wanted to have a housing, not to have housing on our site, we wanted to have a hotel in order to help with tourism, etc. And we got it quite past the district auditor without any problem.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Mike. So what would you say would be the barriers to other local authorities doing similar things? Is it a lack of knowledge and awareness on their part, or is it economic motives, or a mixture?
I think it's going to be mainly economic motives. Local authorities are really with financial difficulties. If someone comes along and offers £2 million for a parcel of land because they can build houses on it, and somebody else wants to do things on that land, which is for the general good of the community, they're looking and saying £2 million would be built as a third, but make up half our funding for a primary school somewhere. Can we afford not to accept it? I think that's where it comes in. But it can be done. It's just you've got to come to a decision. And with money tight, I can understand where local authorities come to that decision, but they're not forced to. And sometimes they give the impression they're forced to because they're trying to not do something because they want the money. But I think that I ask people perhaps have a discussion with the Welsh Local Government Association over this because it can be done.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it, Chris?
I agree. I think money is the primary driver. There's also a lack of knowledge that it can be done, and a fear. And so I've encountered quite a lot of fear in public bodies. They don't want to get it wrong. They don't want to be told off, and they're not prepared to take a risk. And that not taking a risk is holding a lot of development.
Yeah, and I guess in times of austerity as well, there is that fear that what the public really want to see is for whoever is disposing of the land, whether it's local authority or, as Hugh Lewis has put in the chat, examples of the NHS in the past, that fear that what the public want to see is as much money as possible coming back from the sale of that land, rather than looking at other benefits. Well, our Q&A has really kicked off now. We've got a flurry of questions in there, which is fantastic. So I think, gosh, right, I'm just trying to navigate this now. There are so many of them. So we've got one from, where's it gone now? Derek. He asked us whether we think there would be political support for taking forward some of the recommendations mentioned today. So let's have the view from one of the other political groups, maybe Luke or Mabon. Do you think that Plaid Cymru would support some of the recommendations that have been put forward today?
Luke is vice chair of the group, but certainly it's pretty clear that a lot of good ideas have been put forward, and I think as a principle we support, and I would certainly support community ownership and development of projects. I think if you look at examples in my own constituency, where up in a village called Pistich, an old chapel was put on the market and the community couldn't buy it, and it was sold to the highest bidder, and it's now a holiday. So, you know, I think that there are questions around how we can ensure ownership, because land value has now increased so high, and we need to see land value decrease. I know Gwynedd County Council has looked at the land available for its development, and there's not much public land in rural northwest Wales. So we're going to have to look elsewhere. And the one thing, and I think Harry, it'd be interesting Harry's views on chapels and churches. I know Mike's done a lot of work around this. There's a lot of outside of development boundaries, which could be developed for community purposes, for flats or housing or community ventures, and whether or not Harry has thought a little bit more around those issues around chapels and churches.
Harry?
Not specifically on chapels and churches, but it's certainly, you know, if you've got a, you know, as in England or similar in Scotland, if you've got that register of assets of community value, they're nominated by communities. So and you know, if you look in Wales historically, chapels and churches were real centerpieces of communities, and still are in lots of them. So, but there has been sell-offs of them. You often see them being redeveloped for housing or other purposes, community centres in best case scenario. So if we did have that legislation, communities could put, I think chapels and churches would be a really obvious thing that communities would want to nominate to be on that register, and then they would actually have the right of first refusal to buy it and to use it for community use, rather than it going into the private sector to be developed, and then you kind of lose it for the use of community and lose it for that community hub. So I think that although we haven't looked at it specifically, I think there's a lot of relevance to how this legislation could impact on chapels and churches.
Great, thanks very much.
I was just going to jump in there and say that as part of the discussion paper that we put together, we have been working with Housing Justice Cymru, the organisation that manages the Faith and Affordable Housing Project, and also Cutting, the membership body for churches and chapels, and we hope to work with them further to develop the discussion paper, so we get the viewpoints of churches and chapels across Wales when it comes to community ownership. So again, like Harry, it's not something that we've explicitly thought about, but we are having those discussions moving forward.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, so we've got a question from Lucy Taylor, and I think she'd like to come up to the stage to ask her question. So Mike, maybe if you can do the technicalities there for Lucy.
Oh, hi there. Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, from the Community Land Advisory Service in Wales, run by Social Farms and Gardens, and we've been funded by Welsh Government since 2018, and prior to that by the Big Lottery Fund since 2013. Since 2018, we've probably supported over 300 communities to access green spaces. And what Mike was suggesting about local authorities being able to take over assets, or communities take over local authority assets is obviously something that we're very familiar with. The comment I've got really is just to sort of say that in the current times, we are experiencing a very high demand for spaces to be managed by communities, but also increased sort of wanting to put out that level of risk by local authorities, and holding on to assets much more as well. And what I would say is that if a local authority feels that there is any value at all in a piece of land, they will not release it, and they just say that bit of land is not available for disposal. So if there's any chance of them getting housing on that land, and you're not in a position to prove that they can't do that, it can be months and years before the local authority gets around to doing that. So I think it would be great if we could look to find a mechanism for the communities to have a right, like a first right of refusal. I mean, the Local Government Act does allow local authorities to have to sort of pass assets on without getting best value, but we need to go that one step further. We need to have something, and it may well be legislation. I'm a planner, and there are planning policies and supplementary planning guidance, technical advice notes. Things could be written into Planning Policy Wales that could be very helpful in supporting communities. But at the end of the day, we have to enable public bodies to actually force them, I suppose, in a way, to stop looking for the value in the land. We have to let communities have that right, that first right of refusal, because otherwise we're not going to get these community assets happening in our local communities. And it's even worse for Welsh Government. They don't have the benefit of the Local Government Act. The audit office will come down on them, and the Treasury even further. So I think we could start with having an extension of what's in the Local Government Act, by allowing local authorities to give things to communities in the first instance.
Lucy, really useful comments there. Would anybody on the stage like to respond to Lucy there, bringing Chris and Luke and then Mike? Chris?
Just quickly, the risk is that what we get is the assets of no economic value get transferred to the community, and then they really struggle to make and then they're dependent on grant income to keep them going. And they volunteers. I went to a couple of years ago to a fantastic community library that had been taken over down in Mae'n, and the launch of the great event. It was a beautiful building. They stood up and said, "We don't know how we're going to raise the money to pay the utility bills," and it's real. So we need community values and community organisations managing assets which can make money, because then you've got self-generation, then you've got self-determination, and you've got real progress. If it's only the assets which nobody wants because they're not valuable, then you're not making any progress.
Yeah.
Okay. Luke?
No, thanks, Vicky. And I think, this boils down to a lot of what Mike said in terms of, councils wanting to get the best bang for their buck for the land that they have. And as Chris, and that very much chimes with what Chris and Lucy said. And I actually agree quite a bit with what Lucy said. It would be ideal, really, if we can have legislation in place to avoid that, because again, as Chris said, you do risk coming into a position where they just get rid of land that's not worth anything to them, and that's not going to be a sustainable model in the long term. What we want, of course, is for communities to have a reason to go and to take over land, because obviously it's going to be sustainable for them, but it's also going to be part of benefit for the community as well. And I think that legislation has to come, really, because it's either that happens or we have a substantial shift in culture, where people view land as less as financial assets, but more for that community benefit. And that doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. So really, it's incumbent, I think, on government to step in really, or for hopefully the Senedd to step in and pass some legislation.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there, Luke, and I will just I'll go aside a little and say that there's a question that's coming from Hulu is asking whether there's room for Scottish-style legislation in this Senedd term. Of course, none of us can actually answer that because we're not members of the Welsh Government. But what I would suggest is that as the chair of the cross-party group, I'd be very happy to write to Welsh Government and pose that question, and then we can bring the answer back to the next meeting. Mike.
3 quick points. The first one is in Swansea. I know more about Swansea than anywhere else. A lot of sports grounds have now been transferred by lease to football clubs. Rugby clubs tended to own their own grounds anyway, so that's happened. With chapels, and I've written quite extensively on chapels, and especially in the Morriston area, if anybody wants to read about it. But the problem with chapels is that they always come with a huge cost. I mean, do you really want a very big 120-year-old building? I mean, which is one of the problems. And some of these chapels are very large. I mean, I think of Tabernacle in Morriston, which is world famous, but there's also quite a lot of what I call medium-sized chapels. They used to hold 300 people, who probably hold about 30 today, but actually taking those over. There's been money made available for sort of community use, and that'd be by the CFAP funding, and that's gone to a lot of communities and a lot of chapels, communities, and the chapels are developed. And the one I go to in Morriston, Zion Newers, actually had money from it, and that's used it on that. The third question, and I'm going to throw a question now at some of the experts. There's money the Welsh Government get given in capital. I can't remember what it's called at the moment, but it can't be used for public sector expenditure. Is that available to be used by voluntary bodies? It can, a lot of it goes straight out to housing associations, for example, or to the Welsh Bank.
Question, Mike. I can see everybody looking a bit flummoxed there. I wonder if there are any takers. No, maybe that's something else for us to research and come back to the next meeting on, I think. Okay, well, hopefully, Lucy, we've thoroughly aired your question. And so the final question that I can see in the Q&A today comes from Dan Rose. So Dan, we can invite you up to the main stage. You can ask your question there.
Hi, thanks everyone. It's been really interesting. My question really relates to what current powers communities have. There's several areas around myself here where we are in the second largest town in the county, but we only have 6 allotments. We don't really have much community space, although we've got really great SSI common land. They're not really suitable or advisable to be using them for the facilities we want. What powers do we have? Because there's several blocks of land which have been bought up by developers and are, overgrown, and they're just hoarding it until the right time to build properties. Is there anything in Wales that we can utilise to take that on?
Let's see, any takers for that question? Harry?
Yep. I think, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is, are there powers? And the answer bluntly is no, there aren't specific powers. That there are mechanisms you can have that communities go through, and there are helpful organisations and benefactors, including, depends on the local authority and where you're trying to get the land from. But there are, we spoke to lots of landowners and farm owners who were happy to give parts of their land out on a sort of really informal lease basis, like wildlife groups, to manage bits of it. But I suppose one of the fundamental, and I can give you my email address as well and send you a few resources on that too. But I suppose the answer in a big way is in terms of powers, no, there are no formal statutory powers for communities to do this in Wales. So I think also touching on the question that Hugh and someone else put in about is there space for legislation in this Senate term, or and support for it across the parties. I think what we've seen on this issue quite a lot is a really broad but low level of support, where politicians from all political parties kind of say this is a a reasonable idea, and we should do it at some point. But you know, there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of opposition or loud opposition from anywhere to these proposals. So I suppose what we need to see next, a challenge for to the MSs on the call, is that we also need flag bearers for this, but to give those powers that Dan is asking about, because everybody seems to have consistently agreed for a long time that this is quite a good idea, but it never comes into the Welsh Government's programme for government, and it's just never seems to happen. So I think that's where we're kind of at the moment. I hope that's helpful, Dan, and I'll send some stuff on to you as well.
Thanks, Harry. I'd agree with that. Chris?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, so we're this year we'll conclude quite a bit of the work on the Skyline Project in the Upper Rhondda Valley, but we're going to develop some principles which can be used elsewhere, and especially with NRW, I think communities will be able to go to forest land and say, we'd like to co-design this land with you, and we'd like to use that then as a community asset. Where what we're putting into the Rhondda are growing opportunities, energy generation, social tracks and trails, space, performing spaces, all of these things, which is what the community wants to do. And NRW are saying, no, that's fine, we can do that. So actually by working in partnership with them, you may get land which you don't have to own it, but you can get to manage and get your values expressed in how that's managed. And once we've done the one pilot, I think that will be a way of working in the future, which we were doing. And you could also try that, and the logic and the legislative background for that is from the Wellbeing Act. And you could do that. You could try that with your local authority, another public body, and say, look, we can deliver multiple benefits from the Wellbeing Act by working in partnership with you to do this. And in essence, that's what we've done with NRW.
Thanks, Chris. That's a really good practical answer there, Mike.
A place where everybody obsesses over legislation. But can I just say that a letter from the minister to local authorities telling them that they believe that if land could be of benefit to the community, that they believe it should be given over to the community under lease, under restrictive lease, so the community don't get it and then 5 people sell it to build their 10 houses, but under restrictive lease, that would work. But if people are nervous about dealing with district auditors, and I have had my trouble with them in the past, I think that being able to waive a government bit of paper saying this is what we've been told by the Welsh Government we ought to be doing, you need to take it up with them, might well have an effect. And that doesn't need legislation, that just needs the minister to write out and say this is what we would like to see happening.
Mike, I think that's an incredibly practical suggestion, and I think that's something we can also follow up as well as writing to ask about legislation, because for any local authorities who are feeling apprehensive, that would certainly encourage them, and maybe that's all that is needed. Who knows? So thanks very much for that. Okay, I was going
to say, just remember always that we had comprehensive education brought in by a Department of Education circle of Anthony Crossland.
If I can just add also one thing regarding Harry's point. There is a committee structure within the Synod, of course, and I'm a member of the Local Government and Housing Committee, which also has the community part element of it. And when there are other things looking at community, but specifically community infrastructure, the built infrastructure. Now, unfortunately, I've raised this within the committee that we need to look at community assets, but it's not currently on the agenda. It might be an idea for you to write a letter to the chair, John Griffiths, and others present, asking for the committee to specifically look at the built environment within communities.
It's really useful. Thank you, Mabon. I talked to the other guys that I did away about it.
Yeah, thanks, Mabon. Again, really practical suggestions coming forward today. So I hope that everyone so far has got a lot out of the CPG session today. I know I certainly have. We still have some time left for networking up till 1:30. But with the seminary being fully virtual now, it takes the IT team quite some time to get all of us members up and ready and into that session. So I hope that everyone will excuse myself and the other MSs if we head off now to join virtual plenary. And I know that my colleagues, the Secretariat provided by the Wales Co-op Centre will pick up for the rest of the meeting. I can see Mike there on the call. So I'd just like to thank all our speakers for wonderful contributions today, to thank everyone for attending and a really good Q&A as well. And I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible at the next CPG. So Mike, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Vicky. Thanks for great sharing as always. And like I said, we'll be recording today's session. We'll be making that available to all the guests that signed up today. But we'll be taking you back to the networking floor now. So if you want to continue those conversations, by all means, continue to do so. And we look forward to catching up with you all soon. Good afternoon.